thank you so much for being here. So, has anybody stopped to wonder how did they convince so many of our young people that we were going to save the world from cow flatulence with global socialism? I mean, seriously, this is the Green New Deal that Alexandria, what's her name, Vocational Cortex, or whatever. How did they convince people to vote for that? Well, the answer is actually very simple, and I'm going to show you tonight. It's the government school system. Nobody wakes up thinking, hey, we're going to save the planet from cow farts with global socialism. It's just a ludicrous idea. It takes a lot of brainwashing to do it. So I'm going to show you guys tonight some of what the children are learning in government schools. And you know, they say you're always supposed to start a speech with a joke, and I spent a long time trying to think of a joke to introduce the speeches, and I just couldn't. There's just nothing funny you can say about this terrible situation we're in. And it's going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. So I'm going to share some of this with you. First, I want to show you some of the data. You know, we're now at the point where only half of young Americans say they're sure God exists. This in a country that was founded by basically 100% Christians. If you look at the political data, it's even worse. You have 75% of millennials want the government to pay for their health care. You have more than 2/3 of them think the government ought to pay for their college education. Half of them would rather live in a socialist country. And I think this may be out of date. The more recent polls say 60, sometimes as much as 70% of our young people would rather live in a socialist country. You know, I'm from Miami. Go ask people in Miami, hey, what was it like to be in a socialist country? Oh yeah, I remember they stole our farm, they shot my dad in the head, and then they took off. Oh, that's nice. Is that what we want for America? Of course, people don't wake up as socialists, right? I have a 2-year-old at home. You take his teddy bear and say, hey, that's mine. So 2-year-olds understand private property. Somebody brainwashed them into believing that we needed to get rid of private property. And it wasn't their parents, generally speaking. It was the government school system. And then almost half of young Americans want to abolish our border agency. We'll just have no borders, and you know, as Trump says, when you get rid of your borders, you're not a nation anymore, right? Speaking of socialists, there's one on the screen. Maybe you guys can see it. Adolf Hitler, the head of the National Socialist Party in Germany. And of course, his key strategy was brainwashing the children using the government school system. And as he points out here, this is one of those real quotes. It actually came up in the Nuremberg trials. He alone who owns the youth gains the future. And if you think about it, it's self-evident, right? It's more powerful than armies and navies and anything else you can think of. Guns. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than shaping the minds of the young people. So Hitler understood this strategy very well. Lenin understood it. Mao understood it. Stalin understood it. And the people trying to enslave humanity today understand it very well. And the bad news is 87% of our children are currently spending 5 days a week, about 7 hours a day, for a minimum of 12 years in these institutions that are designed to overthrow our freedoms and overthrow our countries. I'm going to give you a little snapshot of what they're learning. But first we need to talk about a few things before we get there. They are coming for your children. And they're not even bothering to hide it anymore. They're telling you on national TV. They don't want you in the picture anymore. And I'm going to show you, one of the reasons I do the PowerPoint presentation, in fact, I hate PowerPoint and I hate presentations. But the reason I do this is because I honestly can't expect you guys to believe some of the stuff I'm going to share with you tonight. It is too crazy. And if I just told you without showing you the proof, I would expect you to say, that's not true, that can't possibly be true, that can't be real. So I'm going to show you the videos so that you can see that what I'm talking about is all true. And here I'm going to show you Melissa Harris Perry on MSLSD, national television, talking about the need to get parents out and have the government take over. So here you go.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
Yeah, I mean, collective farming worked out so well for the Soviets that we should try that with our kids, right? I mean, seriously, where do these people get this? And they're telling us on national television, right? And actually, this is official U.S. government policy. During the waning years of the Obama regime, the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services teamed up. They put together a policy document. They said parents can be equal partners with the government in the raising of their own children. Right? Very soon, we'll be the junior partners. And soon after that, we don't even need the parents anymore. In fact, one of the guys who was in charge of writing this, Arnie, what's his name? Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, he actually said openly and publicly, we need government boarding schools. We should have some of the kids for 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. That's where this is going, right? And they say here we need mandatory home visits, make sure the parents are raising the children in the way the government thinks they ought to be raised. This is dangerous stuff. We've seen this movie before, and it never ends well. Hillary Clinton told us this more than 20 years ago. She said it takes a village to raise the children. And actually, if you read the book, it takes a government village, not your extended family and your neighbors. And then this is what comes out when the government village raises your children. I'm sure if you watch any news at all, if you read any newspapers, you know these faces, right? One is David Hogg on the left there, and then this girl here with the shaved head running around with the communist Cuban patch on her militia jacket. Long story short, one of their fellow classmates shot up the school. And instead of saying, what in the world did they fill this poor child's head up with that he went out and shot the fellow students, they said, oh, I know, we need to disarm law-abiding Americans. That'll solve the problem. Well, we've had guns in America since before there was an America, and the kids didn't used to shoot each other up at school. Something has changed, and it's not the guns, right? It's what they're teaching the children, and I'm going to give you a snapshot of that. But before we get there, I need to point out that there is an agenda. There is an ultimate objective that they're moving us toward, and if we don't understand that there is an end destination to all this, it doesn't really make sense. Why would they do that? Are they just sick in the head? Well, maybe yes, but we need to see where they're going. And rather than tell you about where we're going, I'm going to let them tell you. Again, I think it's more effective if you hear it from them than from me, because who am I? So I'm going to show you, here, George H.W. Bush is the first one we're going to watch. Passed away, what was it, last year?
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founder.
Yeah, so if you were around in 1991 watching television, that was on national TV. They told us what they were doing. And there's a lot there to break down, so we'll just talk about it briefly. But notice he said, when we are successful, and we will be, right? Not maybe if we work really hard and convince enough people, maybe we can possibly succeed. They're sure they're going to succeed. Why are they so sure? Because they have 87% of our children for 5 days a week, for 12 years, for 7 hours a day, and then 4 more if you send them off to college, 2 more if you send them to kindergarten and pre-K, right? What do you think you can do to compete against that? You think you're going to have a conversation with them at dinner and you're going to make everything okay? No way, right? He also said that this new world order, it's going to have the rule of law is going to govern the conduct of nations, right? Obviously, he's talking about global law to govern the conduct of whole nations. And then he says we're going to use the UN's peacekeeping role. He's talking about the UN's military forces. This is the most Orwellian doublespeak you ever heard. If you know anything about the UN's military forces, that ought to send a shiver down your spine. One of their first big peace missions was in Katanga. They wanted to force this province to submit to a mass-murdering Soviet-backed dictator, so they sent in the peace armies with the machine guns and the tanks to bring peace to these people. They slaughtered women and children. They bombed hospitals. They shot at civilian cars that were fleeing to force this people to submit to a mass-murdering dictator. Nice peace troops. In the last 10 years, the estimates suggest that these UN peace troops have raped 60,000 women and children. Guess how many of them are in jail for that? None, right? They all have diplomatic immunity. They can't be prosecuted. So use these peace forces to implement the vision of the UN's founders. And, that's pretty revealing, too. We know something about the UN's founders, right? There was 2 really big parties at the table, Joseph Stalin and his minions, right, the victors after World War II. So they were on one side of the table. Then on our side of the table, we sent good old Alger Hiss, and I think some of you guys probably remember the name. And they liked him so much, they made him the first Secretary General of the UN. He got to run the conference where they came up with the UN Charter. He took them all down to Northern California for the Bohemian Grove so they could do weird little rituals in the redwood forest of California. And then we threw him in jail because he was working for Joe Stalin. So why would we want to give up the vision of our founders for the vision of the UN's founders, enforced at the barrel of a UN peace gun? I don't know, we ought to have a discussion about it. But obviously it's not just the Republican Party, it's not just George H.W. Bush that are on board with this agenda. Here's the Communist Party candidate for 2020. See if we can get it.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
Yeah, so their task was to create a new world order. Who knew? Right? I thought they said they were going to uphold the Constitution and put their hand on the Bible, but no, their task was to build a new world order. And here the rapist Bill Clinton agrees.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
Right, so anyways, we could spend a week here watching videos of world leaders talking about they're going to build a new world order. Again, they never asked us if we wanted a new world order. And they have a lot of different strategies to bring this about. But I submit to you that the most important strategy they have in their toolbox is the government education system. That is how they're preparing us for this. They know they're never going to talk us into giving up our private property and giving up our free speech and giving up our Constitution and surrendering control of our border. They know that the people in this room are never going to go for that. But they also know that if they get our children from a young age and they brainwash them for 12 years, they will almost inevitably succeed, right? So that's enough about the deep state. If you want to know about the deep state, we've got some copies of the special report out front. You can learn who these people are, what they're up to, what their real agenda is, who their master is, right? And you know, they talk a lot about sustainable development. We'll come back to this in a moment too. But I think the easiest way to understand, this is kind of the motivating ideology or theology, if you will. The easiest way to understand it is just take everything that God has ordained, everything that God has mandated, flip it upside down, and then you get a good sense of what they're talking about. So, you know, go back to the beginning in Genesis, be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth. The UN says, scratch all of that, right? Don't be fruitful. Don't even think about multiplying and subdue the earth. Are you kidding? You might hurt a lizard or a cockroach. No way. Right? They say male, God created them male and female. No. Now we're older and wiser. Now we know that gender is a spectrum, right? And I'll show you what they're teaching the kids. Private property. God said, thou shalt not steal. So what do we see? Brainwashing the kids to become little socialists, right? Can't have private property. God ordained that there should be nations. In fact, the Bible tells us multiple times God ordained that there should be nations. God separated the people after the Tower of Babel. So what do we see? A war on nations. They want to merge all the nations together, first in these regional superstates like the European Union, the African Union, the Eurasian Union. Down in South America, they've got the Union of South American States. Here in America, they're working on the North American Union, and ultimately into a global system. So everything that God ordained for our good, for people, is under attack, and that's really the motivating ideology and theology behind all this, and I'm going to show you how this works. They have several international agreements that underpin all of this to give it kind of a veneer, at least, of legality, right? Our government has signed on to these, so has every other government in the world. You have Agenda 21. My friend and colleague Bill Jasper, who's sitting here, actually went down to the UN summit where they came up with Agenda 21 over 20 years ago. And you know, he did a lot of the real reporting that exposed this. Then we have Agenda 2030. So I'm going to show you, in both cases, they will tell you what they're doing and how they're going to do it. And what you'll see is that in both cases, education is going to be the key.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. We're included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document.
So anyways, I show that just to show you, the CNN fake news will tell you, Agenda 21, that's a conspiracy theory. Don't worry about Agenda 21. Well, was the president talking about a conspiracy theory he had just signed? And hey, this is not a partisan issue either.
The Earth Summit Environmental Leadership Act, as this is known, presents us with an opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21.
A comprehensive national strategy in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21. That'll be fun. If you're wondering what Agenda 21 is, it was summarized very nicely by these people here who were involved in creating Agenda 21, and they'll tell you that it proposes an array of actions intended to be implemented by every person on Earth. That includes your kids and your grandkids and the pygmies and every last tribesman in the Amazon rainforest. They mean everybody. There's no asterisks exempting American homeschoolers or anybody else. Everybody is supposed to be involved in this. And then they tell you it's going to require a profound reorientation of all human society unlike anything the world has ever experienced. So just let that sink in. They're talking about monumental changes to everything we hold dear, everything we grew up with, everything that we love is under threat. And they're telling us this, right? And then how are they going to get there? I already said they're never going to convince us. We're too old for that. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. So how are they going to convince people that this is a good idea? They'll tell you, chapter 36, education is critical for promoting sustainable development. This is straight from the text of Agenda 21. You can read it on the UN website. They'll tell you formal and non-formal education are indispensable. You can't dispense with it if you want this sustainable world order. It's indispensable for changing people's attitudes. They tell you that it's critical for achieving the right values, attitudes, and behavior that's consistent with sustainable development. And they tell you that it needs to include spiritual development. Well, what about the wall of separation between church and state? We can't let them teach spirituality to our children.
Oh, well, they will, right? It's just not the spirituality you think. They're not talking about the 10 Commandments. Just to give you some sense of what they're talking about, this is an Agenda 21 book for children produced by the United Nations. I have a copy. You should get one. It will blow your mind. This is one of the pages. You see the Hindu gods looking very perplexed and confused and upset because the storks are delivering all these babies. And what did God say? God said children are a blessing, right? God said people are made in His image. God said we should be fruitful and multiply. What does the UN say? This is on the next page. The earth groans every time it registers another birth. That's what the UN thinks. Every time a new baby comes, the earth is groaning. That's what they're teaching to your children. That's why your kids... Got to get rid of 6.5 billion people. And the funny thing is they never volunteer to go first. I have it on good authority that Ted Turner was the one who put that abomination there. And guess what? He's got 5 kids. So for you, not for them, right? That's how they do. But anyways, we were talking about the UN Agenda 21 book. This was for children, right? They use this in government schools all over the world. 20 years after Bill Jasper was down in Rio for the original Earth Summit, I went down to the Rio Plus 20 years after the Earth Summit, and they had conscripted a bunch of poor children into drawing these posters. And I don't know if you guys can see it, but the Earth is sick, and he's got the thermometer, and he's very sad. And the doctor comes up, and he diagnoses. He says, I know your problem. You have humans. So humans are the disease, and the UN is going to be the savior, right? Isn't that cute? That's what they mean when they talk about sustainable development. This was at the Sustainable Development Conference. Another fun fact, the conference was chaired by a Chinese communist. His name was Xia Zhakung, and his claim to fame was that he gave awards to the generals who massacred all the students at Tiananmen Square. I mean, who else would you put in charge of the conference to decide the future of humanity? More recently, in 2015, they got Agenda 2030. It's like Agenda 21, but for nations, for regional governments like the EU. And I want to show you just a couple videos from the UN so you get a sense of, it's them telling you that education is how they're going to bring this about. It's not me telling you.
For all our differences and diversity, the world can agree on one thing. Education is at the heart of a sustainable future for us all.
All right, education is at the heart of a sustainable future for us all. And they'll tell you, children, this is right from Agenda 2030, children are critical agents of change. Did you know your children were critical agents of change? Now you do. And they're going to find in these new goals a platform to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. Well, that sounds nice. We're going to turn our kids into activists. They're going to go out and create a better world. What do they mean when they say they're going to make a better world? We don't have to speculate. They'll tell us. Goal number 10, this is a direct quote. We're going to reduce inequality within and among countries. So it's not enough anymore just to have national socialism. Now we need to go full-blown global socialism if we want a better world. And of course, they're not talking about taking money from the Rockefellers and George Soros and the Rothschilds and Bill Gates and redistributing it to hungry people. They're talking about taking your money, poor and middle-class Americans, and redistributing it to the UN and to the dictators who have impoverished much of the rest of the world. That's what they mean. And I mean, this stuff could have come straight out of the Communist Party handbook from Zimbabwe or Cuba or North Korea. This is the guiding philosophy that made Venezuela so prosperous, right? They say that this is only going to be possible if we share the wealth and if we address income inequality. Then they tell you that in this same Agenda 2030, we commit to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods. How are they going to change the way we produce and consume goods? Well, they're going to control the way we produce and consume goods. And we've seen this movie before, haven't we? It always ends the same way. Concentration camps, mass slaughter, starvation, shortages of basic goods. I mean, if you want to see how well these ideas work, I mean, there's lots of examples around the world. Venezuela, I hear, is nice this time of year. You can go take a look. They're eating their pets. The average Venezuelan lost about 25 pounds last year from malnutrition. It is not an idea that we want to see implemented in our country, much less around the world. And then, you know, the crucial component of all this, they need a pretext for this, right? Because, I mean, we're doing pretty well. We're not hungry. Our environment's pretty clean here in America. How are we going to talk Americans into jumping on this bandwagon? Well, we got to convince them climate change is going to kill us all, right? Cow farts and CO2 is going to kill us all. Here's Obama explaining Agenda 2030, how glorious it is and how climate change underpins the whole agenda. And, you know, for those of you who believe in climate change, if there is anybody in here, you know, obviously the climate has always changed, but here in the blue line, you have the average of the satellite temperature data. The green line is the average of the weather balloon data. And the red line is the UN's projections. That's the average of the UN's forecast. So you could literally put a monkey in a cage, give him some dice. The monkey could roll the dice. The monkey would do a far better job of predicting future temperatures than the United Nations and all their, you know, quack scientists and their supercomputers and their climate models. They're wrong, right? Their hypothesis is wrong. And it's obvious. But anyways, here is some of the ruins from back when the Vikings were farming on Greenland. Funny that, right? They tell us the earth has never been hotter. That's a bunch of baloney. The Vikings used to farm on Greenland. You can't farm anything on Greenland today. It's much too cold, right? Anyways, they'll tell you, again, how are we going to achieve this sustainable world? Go back to Agenda 2030. Goal number 4, they'll tell you, education is going to be the key, right? And notice, they say that by 2030, all learners, again, no exemption for American homeschoolers, all learners need to be so brainwashed, they won't just submit to sustainable development or passively accept it. They will go out and actually promote it. They need to promote sustainable development. That's going to take some doing, right? The UN Secretary General said this was the global declaration of interdependence. The head of the UN General Assembly called it the master plan for humanity. The Communist Chinese Party was bragging in every propaganda organ they had that we played a crucial role in developing this. Robert Mugabe, the genocidal mass murdering dictator of Zimbabwe, who was recently removed, said, oh, this is wonderful. We're going to usher in a brave new world. The socialist head of NATO, retired, Javier Solana, said it was going to bring about the next great leap forward. And, you know, most people who are educated in government schools don't know what that means, but if you know anything about China's history, you know that is not a fun idea, right? About 50 million people died in the last Great Leap Forward. We do not want another one. Here's more UNESCO propaganda, right? They know they're not going to get us. How are they going to get us?
We achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
So sustainable development begins with education, and we got to put global education first, right? And I want to show you guys how this works. A generation ago, 20 years ago, in the early 1990s, the LGBT thing was not on anybody's radar. Nobody was thinking about this. Sodomy was still a crime across most of the United States. People just weren't even thinking about it. If you had told people that we were going to have homosexual marriages, they would have laughed at you. They would have said, that is absurd. You're some kind of... And actually, the JBS warned about that a long time ago. They said, oh, that's kooky, you're fear-mongering. They were right. But anyways, I want to show you what they did. In the early 1990s, they produced this documentary called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues in school. And nobody was thinking about this. And I want to show you just a brief clip from this documentary with a short introduction from the American Family Association so you can see what they showed the children in the early 1990s in government schools when we weren't paying attention.
Sexuality. One homosexual teacher steers his kids to the politically correct view of marriage.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're the same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges for a few minutes. What I'm going to give each of you is a sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, and that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to two adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
See why they shouldn't.
Notice they all come to the politically correct view. They show our little kids, oh yeah, we pretend judges, we should totally strike that down. And then one generation later, the pretend judges struck down all our marriage laws. And we weren't happy about it, but hey, they had brainwashed enough of the kids that they got away with it, right? So they were preparing the children back then to make their next move. They're preparing the children today to make their next move. So I want to show you a little bit about where this is all going. This is now, modern day Portland Public Schools marching in a pride parade. They've got, oh my goodness, more pride parade stuff. This is Good Morning America.
If you haven't heard the name,
about as mainstream as can get.
Ready for
a drag kid,
11-year-old drag kid, who RuPaul is calling the future in bravery. Is
the future of bravery. Can you believe it?
We're going to talk to him in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at his amazing story.
I am Desmond. I'm 11 years old, and I like pizza, trains, and...
Anyway, this goes on for 11 minutes, but you don't need to watch it all. It's horrifying. The parents took this kid to a homosexual bar, grown men throwing money at him while he's dancing around. Unbelievable stuff. This is how far our society has fallen. It's a direct result of what was taught to the children in the government indoctrination system. So today, they're teaching our children all of that and a whole lot more. I'm going to give you a brief snapshot. We'll start with this... and this, I almost feel ridiculous even saying it, but they're teaching the children today in government schools in every state in America, in every community in America, and all over the world, that the gas they exhale, if you went to school prior to the 2000s, you know that we exhale carbon dioxide. It's also called plant food. Life couldn't exist without this fundamental to life gas. They're teaching the kids that this gas is a toxic pollution and that we need to let the UN tax and regulate it or we're all going to die. So... I feel ridiculous saying it because it's ridiculous, but this is what they're teaching the kids. And they know they're not going to persuade adult Americans of that. They've done the polling. They know most adult Americans know this is ridiculous. But I want to show you what they're teaching the kids. This is what the UN says.
We hope that as many schools as possible will follow examples like this, and we will support them in their efforts. Education is a powerful tool to address climate change and to ensure that the rights and needs of people today and tomorrow can be met. Let us use it and get active today.
Education is a tool to address climate change? Really? I mean, the climate's been changing since God put the planet here. How in the world is education going to address climate change? Well, the answer is they're not actually trying to address climate change, right? They have other ambitions. And I'm going to show you here what this looks like in an American classroom, and you can see what they're teaching the kids.
You've heard the reports. The globe's warming. It's our fault, and the consequences will be terrible.
Children are frightened.
I worry. My mom worries. The water might rise and it might flood the whole town.
We won't be able to survive for long.
What are you most worried will happen?
We'll all die.
Are there some people who say this isn't true?
Yes. Yes.
Might they be right?
No.
How do you know they're not right?
Well, because the earth is getting hotter.
Where do you learn this?
Can't you see?
Oh, can't you see? It's like a doomsday cult, right? Pass the Kool-Aid. Creepy.
Can't you see? Oh, can't you see? What global warming is doing to me?
One of the main components.
Now they turn them into political activists.
Educating the students of global warming is that they're given a letter for their families to sign, and this is the congressman or woman. It's for Congress to pass comprehensive climate and energy legislation.
So you get this great...
So anyways, you get the point. They turn them into activists, get your congressmen involved and all the rest of it. Here they are, protesting out in the streets for climate justice. And what the schools are doing today is not actually teaching the children in any sense that we might recognize education, right? What they're doing, and they're pretty open about it now, is changing the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the children. And I'm going to show you, my friend Charlotte Iserbit, she was the senior advisor on education policy in the Reagan administration, and when she got to her office at the Department of Education, came across all these documents that they were turning our education system into a carbon copy of the Soviet Union's. She said, well, that's not good. So she started leaking these documents. Human Events published some of them. She eventually compiled them into this book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. You can get it for free online because the print copy is about $600. you should get one. And here's what she said about what's happening in the government school system.
You think the purpose of education is reading, writing, and arithmetic? The purpose of education is to change the thoughts, actions, and feelings of students.
And now I'm going to show you from one of the people who was actually involved in writing national standards under the Bush and Clinton administrations. She was the director at the Mid-Continental Research Laboratory, and she's going to explain much the same thing, but from the perspective of, hey, this is a good thing.
Fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation in the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society. We have moved into a new era.
The total transformation of our society. And here she's going to explain how the schools are bringing this about.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is and then move back and figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of school.
So the social change function of schools, they're going to anticipate the future. No doubt they're going to use their crystal ball, and they're going to say, oh, what do the kids need? Well, of course they don't know what the future is, right? They're going to decide what they want in the future, and how do we brainwash the children to get there? The social change function of schools, to bring about the complete transformation of our society. And this was at the National Governors Association, which helped bring about Common Core. They're all applauding, governors from all across America, applauding this drivel. A big part of this, again, is the indoctrination, the sexualization, the perversion of our children. This happened in Florida last year. A girl woke up and said, hey, I think I'm a boy. So, the school administration, instead of saying, yeah, you probably need some help, honey, because actually you're a girl, right? Every cell in your body testifies to the fact that you're a girl. They said, oh, you should go change and shower with the boys before PE. And the male PE teacher was forbidden from telling the boys that she was going to come in there. She walked in and literally caught them with their pants down. And then he was ordered to go in there and supervise all this. He said, well, I can't do that. There's a naked girl in there. We used to throw people in prison for that kind of thing, right? Peeping Toms. Oh, no, you have to, or we're going to fire you and take away your teaching credential. And, long story short, ended up in a lawsuit. We got the documents. Liberty Counsel got the documents. They were exchanging emails, the school administration. We have to use this guy as an example so that no other teacher will ever resist this crazy agenda. In Minnesota, they went even further. A boy decided one day, oh, actually, I think I'm a girl. Mom, Dad, can I have a sex change? No. So the school said, oh, well, we know better. We'll take him to go have his genitals surgically removed. And they did. And there's a federal lawsuit now, but guess what? The boy's genitals are not coming back, right? That ship has sailed. It's a permanent operation. This is what they're teaching to 5-year-olds in California. Who are you? A kid's guide to gender identity. And that old thing about male and female, that's old-fashioned. That's bigoted now. We're older, wiser. Now we know gender is a spectrum, and you can be anywhere on the spectrum. They give the kids 15 examples they can choose from: agender, bigender, trigender, new trois, free spirit, things I can't even pronounce, absurdities, right? Biological realities, there's 2 genders. But anyway, they say you're not limited to those 15. You can choose one for yourself. You can invent one for yourself. And maybe the next day you'll feel different, then you could choose a different one, right? And they say actually adults have to guess what gender babies are because babies can't talk yet. So that's where this is going. Here's another one, and this is why I bring the videos in, right? I couldn't expect anybody to believe this ridiculousness. So in California, they passed a law saying that the state they mandated the teaching of LGBT history in the schools. No opt-out for parents. And as part of this, they were using a presentation. And in this LGBTQ history, one of the milestones was, oh yeah, in Greece, men used to take young boys under their wing and do unspeakable things that we can't talk about here. Big milestone on the road to LGBTQ equality and all that nonsense. And so a concerned mom said, wait a minute, you're teaching my kids pedophilia? Why are you doing that? And in a sane world, the assistant superintendent would say, well, that's crazy. We would never do such a thing. Well, here's what she actually said.
Answer me why you're teaching pedophilia in school to 9th graders. Teaching what? Pedophilia. Pederasty, right here.
Pederasty, as I've discussed with you before, twice in my office when you come to view the materials, I've explained to you that this is done because we are talking about historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history. So this is something, something that's occurred in history, and so this is really important for us to include.
So it's something that has occurred in history. So it's really important that we teach the kids this. Well, I can think of a lot of things that occurred in history that they're not teaching the kids. I mean, Jesus walked on this earth, right? They won't teach the kids that, right? You could be sure. But she said it's a sexual orientation that has occurred in history. We got to teach the kids. Think about the implications of that, folks. In California, it's against the law to discriminate based on sexual orientation. In Washington State, I'm pretty sure that's the case as well. Well, they're teaching the children that child rape is a sexual orientation. So what happens in 20 years when these kids grow up? Well, of course you need to hire a pedophile to run your Sunday school ministry. You don't want to run afoul of the law, do you? This is where this is going, folks. And there was a big uproar about this. People got mad and said, oh, we're not going to do it anymore. We're sorry. But you can bet it'll come back as soon as they think they can get away with it. This is the Drag Queen Story Hour. Man wearing a dress and demon horns. I guess they decided they didn't need to be subtle anymore. Just tell you, they come straight from the pit of hell, right? And they read these stories to the children about Heather has two mommies and, the homosexual worms who got married and lived happily ever after. Some of these guys have actually been convicted pedophiles. Yeah, and they're going into schools all over America, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and reading these stories to children. This is Jessica Lahore, another drag queen they brought into a middle school in Colorado for Career Day. And I wrote an article questioning whether this was a good decision to expose children to this. And in the name of tolerance, they said, you're intolerant. You should kill yourself. This whole mob of them came after me, flooded my email and my Facebook. Very tolerant, these people, right? You should kill yourself if you disagree that this is appropriate for children. Very tolerant. And now we're starting to see the consequences, right? 27% of children, according to a study last year out of the University of California at Los Angeles, 27% of 12 to 17-year-old children are gender non-conforming, according to their own responses to the survey. It's more than 1 in 4. I was a kid not that long ago, and I never once, on 4 continents, I never once met a boy who thought he was a girl or a girl who thought she was a boy. In fact, the word transgender wasn't even in the dictionary when I was a kid in the late 80s, early 90s. Just wasn't a thing. It didn't exist. Now, 27% of California's children. You think this happened by accident? This is what they're being taught in the schools. The next generation is going to be 50%. When are we going to speak out? When it's 75%? When are we going to take our kids out? When our kid is asking for a sex change? Is that when we're going to act? I hope we won't wait that long. NBC Fake News says 20% of millennials now identify as LGBTQ. So I no longer identify as a millennial. That's one of many reasons. And there's a whole bunch of these surveys now showing that in some cases 50% of teenagers are saying they're LGBTQ. This is a UNESCO report, Global Guidelines for International Sexuality Education. By the time they're 5, they should know about sexual pleasure and masturbation. In what universe do 5-year-olds need to know about sexual pleasure, unless you're grooming them for some unspeakable crime? They say that 9-year-olds need to be able to defend tax-funded abortions. Yeah, that's good. They want this in every school on the planet, and they publish it. Right? This is what they're saying in the open. Imagine what they say behind closed doors. They want to teach kindergartners about gender confusion, homosexuality, encourage fornication, and then when you get to the back, they have sample questions from those pesky parents. You can't teach that to my kids. And then they have the responses that the educator should give. Oh, well, this is evidence-backed. This is a science-based curriculum. And so then in the back, you look at the footnotes. What is the evidence that says you have to teach a 5-year-old about sexual pleasure? Oh, well, Planned Parenthood shows up more than 20 times. Surprise, the largest mass murder of unborn babies in America is their source for this evidence. Of course, they're dumbing down the kids, right? They're not getting anything remotely close to a real education. Here, there's hundreds of these videos all over YouTube. They force the kids to sing praises to Dear Leader. You can check it out.
Okay, now everybody, let's sing it together on the count of 3. All right. No, I like that. 1, 2, 3. Barack Hussein Obama. He said we all must lend a hand to make this country strong again.
Can you imagine if they were saying that Donald Trump was going to make America great again? Oh my goodness, the heads on CNN would be exploding all over the screen and there'd be riots and the ACLU would be suing. But when they sing the praises to Dear Leader Obama, no one says a word, right? It's quite appropriate. But of course, Obama's not going to make America strong again. In fact, he set out on a mission to dumb down America further than we've ever been dumbed down before, and he was very successful. In fact, now the federal government has funded studies showing he was successful. One of the things he did was bring in Common Core using the stimulus money. He bribed the 50 states, threatened them, bludgeoned them, gave them waivers from other educational fiascos if they would adopt this. And just to give you some sense of how bad this is, This is Sandra Stotsky, a picture of Sandra Stotsky, the only English language expert on the Common Core Validation Committee. These were hand-picked experts by the Common Core people who were going to rubber stamp this and say, oh, it's great, you should use it in all the schools. Well, the only English expert, Sandra Stotsky, she's a nice lady, progressive on a lot of things, she supports national standards, but she's nice enough. I serve on a board with her, and she's a delightful person. But she says the Common Core is going to reduce the ability of children to develop critical thinking skills. And I think that's probably the point. She says they were written poorly by people who didn't care how poorly they were written. This lady here, Dr. Louisa Moats, was not on the validation committee, but she was hired to help write the reading standards. And she's also progressive on everything. We wouldn't agree on much. But we do agree children should learn how to read, and they should learn how to read the only way children can learn how to read our language, which is using phonics. Turns out they took out all the great stuff she put in, replaced it with a bunch of quackery, and so I interviewed her a few months ago. She said, kids cannot learn how to read this way. This is ridiculous. So the only math expert on the Common Core Validation Committee, this guy here, James Milgram, he's on that same board that I mentioned earlier with U.S. Parents Involved in Education. Nice guy also from Stanford. He said, these standards are written to reflect very low expectations. They're as non-challenging as possible with extremely serious failings. Some of them are based on incorrect math. They are neither mathematically correct nor especially clear. So like Sandra Stotsky, he also refused to sign off on the standards. They just took their names off the website and pretended they didn't exist. So,
what does
here's Common Core math for you.
For your kids? Well, here's a sample math problem.
Compose and decompose numbers from 11 to 19 into 10 ones and some further ones by using objects or drawings, and record each composition.
That's my producer, Ricky Ratliff, right outside the studio, asking people to solve a Common Core math problem.
10 plus 8. Understand that these numbers are composed of 10 ones and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Seem complex? No kidding. And yet that is a problem for kindergarten students, 5- and 6-year-olds. Seems crazy to me. Here's a question some first graders will get under the standards.
Okay, kids, class is in session.
What is 32 minus 12? 20, right? You just subtract. But not under the new Common Core method.
Why are they going through this backwards method here?
This man who trained in nuclear engineering couldn't understand it.
I don't understand.
He wasn't alone.
So anyways, it goes on and on, but you get the point. This is ridiculous, right? And then you wonder why the poor kid at McDonald's, 25 years old, can't make change for a $20 bill. There you go, right? They learn to hate math by the time they're in first grade. What is this? Ridiculous. This makes no sense. I must be a moron. This was the most dumbest subject I've ever heard of. I'm not interested. I have no interest in pursuing that. And so, of course, they don't do math, right? You think they're going to engineer some nice bridges in the future? They also have pseudo-science standards, the same people who brought you Common Core, all of them affiliated with the deep state, by the way, the leaders of all these organizations, members of Bilderberg, members of the Council on Foreign Relations, etc. But these national science standards, they call them the next generation science standards. There's really no science in there. You won't learn about the scientific method, right? But you will learn two key things at every single level. First one, you'll learn that the gas you exhale is a toxic pollution and only the UN can save us, right? So from a scientific perspective, that's asinine. From the perspective of a totalitarian, there's nothing better, right? There's nothing you can do that doesn't involve emitting CO2. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't turn on a light switch, you can't even die without emitting CO2, because as you decompose, CO2 is released. There's nothing you can do that doesn't involve emitting CO2. So if you're the UN and you want to run everybody's lives, you want to tax them for everything, you say, CO2 is pollution. Carbon pollution, they call it now. And so that's what they're teaching the kids at every single level under the national science standards. And then you get to the other point. The kids need to understand that they came from slime that turned into fish, that turned into monkeys, that turned into people over billions of years, and there is no God. As long as you understand those things, you're good. That's all you need to know. They also have fake history. You should look at some of the history books aligned with the Common Core. They'll tell them about the Second Amendment. Protects the right of the government to form a militia. Right? I'm serious. They won't quote the Second Amendment. They'll tell them the purpose is to protect the government's right to a militia. If and when they do teach about the Pilgrims, which is very rare, they'll quote maybe the Mayflower Compact. They say, we undertook a voyage, ... to America. What's in the ... Well, the reason they undertook the voyage, for the glory of God, to spread the gospel, to advance the kingdom. But they don't want the kids to know those things. There's separation of church and state and all that. Instead, they came here to commit genocide and to murder Native Americans and to steal land and to bring slavery and all these horrible things. That's what they're teaching the kids. My colleague, Dr. Duke Pesta, who runs the Freedom Project Academy, he was mentioned earlier, he really helped us with this issue. He wrote some of the articles, and he's really working closely with us on this project to rescue our children. He teaches at universities now. He was at Purdue, now he's at the University of Wisconsin, and he does surveys of his kids every year for the last 10 years. He says every year, without exception, more than half of the new kids coming out of the government school system into his class believed America invented slavery. So if they knew any real history, they would know slavery has been ubiquitous throughout human history. Virtually every culture, every civilization has practiced some form of slavery. And then this amazing civilization popped up that said, God created us all equally, and God endowed us with inalienable rights. And it was these principles that led to the abolishing of slavery, not just in the United States, but all over the world with some help from Britain and Wilberforce and all these. And that's why slavery is no longer legal anywhere in the world. I mean, it was still legal in 2007, up until 2007 in Mauritania, but the kids have no idea. They think America is a uniquely evil nation that invented slavery. And so is it any wonder that they want to burn down the country? If they knew the truth, it would be just the opposite, right? America is an incredible place. We ended this scourge that has afflicted humanity throughout all of human history, and yet the kids have no idea. Here's the 5 pillars of Islam at the school in Kansas, right? Oh, this doesn't affect me. I'm in a conservative district. Oh, yes, it does, right? This is everywhere. They're teaching the kids to recite the Shahada, the Islamic conversion prayer, that Allah is the only God and Muhammad is his messenger and these things. Can you imagine if the 10 Commandments were up on the wall? The ACLU would be freaking out. Here's EMAR, the friendly robot. That's literally what it's called. The federal government figured out that kids would be more likely to give over their mental health data to a robot than to a person, so they created EMAR. Here, this came straight out of a Department of Education report. On the left, you see a facial expression camera. And if you read the Department of Education report that talks about this, it says it should analyze the facial expressions that children make as they're exposed to stimuli and determine if a child needs an intervention. So, maybe hypothetically a guy walks in wearing a dress and some demon horns to read the story about homosexual worms, and the kid goes, ugh, what in the world is going on here? Aha, this one needs an intervention, right? That's where this is going. They call it social and emotional learning. It's not about academics anymore. It's about the attitudes that the children display. And they're treating the children as circus animals, stimulus response mechanisms. When the right stimulus is presented, the children are expected to have the right response. And if there's a disconnect there, if they don't display the right response, then we need to circle back and do it all again. Until the kids get it right, then they can move on. Right? And a lot of this now takes place through the computer with the aid of technology like this. This is from another Department of Education report. They tell you that the big data captured from all of this computers, all these users' online behaviors, is going to enable the algorithms to infer the user's knowledge, intentions, and interests. And get this, it's going to enable the creation of models that will help predict their future behavior and interests. So at some point very soon, the government thinks it's going to be able to predict what your children are going to think, how they're going to behave, what they're going to believe when they're older. The government already knows more about your children than you do, without any question. They're collecting hundreds of data points on your children. They're giving them surveys. How does your mom talk to your dad? How does your dad talk to your mom? What religion are you? What kind of food do you have in your refrigerator? How do you get disciplined? What do you believe about LGBT? Do you have lots of sex? Do you take drugs? What do you think about drugs? All of this data. Their dental records, right? And now they've got mental health data, dental data, their nutrition data. What kind of food do you eat at home? All of this is going into federal databases. They're all being linked together. They are creating an Orwellian monster. They also have values clarification, and I was exposed to this as a child. It had a profound impact on me. I still remember it like it was yesterday. The UNESCO, they'll tell you in their little handbook, global handbook for how they promote this, the purpose is to break down the belief in moral absolutes among the children. Well, why would you want to do that? Maybe if you were planning to do something immoral, right? And I'll give you an example of how it works, something along the lines of what they did to me. They say, hey, so you're stuck in a life raft, and there's 9 of you in the life raft, but the life raft can only support 8 people. And you have a doctor and an engineer and a lawyer and a policeman. Who are you going to throw overboard so that you can all survive? And I know you all know the correct answer. It's the lawyer. Just kidding. Right? If the kids put on their thinking caps, they say, well, wait a minute. We actually don't have to kill somebody. We can just take turns swimming alongside the raft, and then nobody has to die. Right? That would be the obvious answer, but that's not what the kids are supposed to come up with. They're supposed to come up with, my pastor said we shouldn't kill. My Bible says we shouldn't kill. My parents said we shouldn't kill. And here we're confronted with a situation where the only moral option is to kill somebody. So what do I believe now? Well, now I understand morality is situational. Values are subjective. It depends on maybe there is a time and a place for concentration camps, or for killing babies, or for killing old people. Right? It's for the greater good. We need to do that. And now we understand, because now we're enlightened. That is the purpose of these exercises. They've been doing them for decades, and the effects on children are devastating. They're catastrophic. I remember, because I went through it. You don't have to believe me that they're not getting an education. In fact, the federal government will proudly tell you that the kids are coming out dumber than ever before. Right? Every 2 years, they do a national assessment of educational progress. They survey a representative sample of students from across the country, and this is what their data shows. Over 2/3 of 8th graders in America are below proficient in math. And these are about as dumbed down as you can get. We're not talking calculus or even algebra here. We're talking about as dumbed down as you can get. They say just 1/3 of 8th graders are proficient in English. Just 1/4 of high school seniors are proficient in math, and just 1/3 of high school seniors are proficient in reading. And most of these who are not proficient in reading are going to go on. And mind you, proficient is not, a high level. Proficient is just basic, can barely meet the skill, right? So that's where we are. Of course, these illiterate teenagers grow up to be illiterate adults. The federal government did a literacy survey in 1993. They split Americans into 5 categories. Category 1, totally illiterate. Category 5, good reader. 50% of Americans were in the bottom 2 categories. So about half of our people are illiterate or very close to it. They don't read anything. They don't read the newspaper. They don't read books. They don't read their Bible. They don't read anything, right? Half of our people. In 2003, they did another, same thing. Half of Americans are illiterate. In some places, Washington, D.C., State Education Agency report said over 2/3 of the adults above age 15 are illiterate. Most of them have high school diplomas. How in the world do you get a high school diploma if you can't read it? We spent $200,000 getting these kids high school diplomas, and they can't read. Do you think that's an accident? I have some nice beachfront property in Nebraska afterwards. Talk to me then. Ronald Reagan put together a commission in 1983, the National Commission on Excellence in Education, and I don't agree with all the conclusions. In fact, I think some of it's very wrong-headed. But they said that our nation, the educational foundations of our society are being eroded in a way that threatens our future as a nation and as a people. Serious language from a government commission. They also said that if a foreign power had done this to us, we would have viewed it as an act of war. That's serious talk from bureaucrats, right? And this is a serious issue. That was in the 80s. By comparison, we had a fantastic education system in the 1980s compared to the fiasco that we have today. We were once a highly educated nation. Washington, D.C., I mentioned earlier, when they started getting these results back, our people can't even read anything. What did they do? They didn't look back to what we were doing 100 years ago when we were the most literate, most educated society on the planet. They literally went to communist Cuba. They took the mayor, the school superintendent, or the district superintendent, the school board. They took them all to communist Cuba to learn what the communists were doing. And they were thrilled. So, we weren't always this dumb, right? John Adams wrote in a letter to a friend that a Native American who can't read or write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. Today, it's half of us. Back then, it was as rare as a comet or an earthquake. Thomas Jefferson would brag that American farmers were the only ones in the world who read Homer. How many people today are reading Homer? How many farmers, how many high school graduates read Homer, right? The Federalist Papers, right? This is incredible evidence that our people were very highly educated. These were written for farmers and blacksmiths and shoemakers. These were not for, PhDs in English literacy. These were for normal people. Go ask a college graduate to read them today, even in modern English. We have a lot of surveys, studies on early America and literacy. This study out of the University of Montana found that 95% of Americans by 1795 could read. Almost 100% in cities like Boston. This guy, DuPont de Nemours, studied this issue in 1812 and found that not more than 4 in 1,000 young Americans could not read and write legibly. I can't write. I can't even read my own handwriting. I don't know about you guys, but that's pretty incredible. They were doing a lot better back then than we were today, and they didn't have government schools. Surprise. Right, exactly. Most of the kids learned how to read on the farm from their parents or from their older siblings. They used very simple tools. It's not complicated to teach kids reading. Right? It's really not. You can do it with 50-cent blueback speller, the New England Primer. It's not rocket science. Then this guy came along, Horace Mann. He had been to Prussia. He admired what the Prussian dictatorship was doing, brainwashing a bunch of kids into being good little statists. And so he wanted to bring that to America, and he did. It was a horrible system, but it did exactly what he wanted. He wanted public education to equalize all men, as he put it. He wanted to get the Bible out of the schools, which was revolutionary at the time. And he also introduced this whole word method of teaching reading into the schools. And, it was developed with the best of intentions by a reverend who wanted to teach deaf children how to read. No fault there. But when they tried it out in the government schools in Boston, it was a total disaster. So within a few years, all the schoolmasters in Boston rose up and they wrote this brilliant essay. You should read it. It's more relevant today than it was back then. They said, the change proposed by Mr. Mann is neither called for nor sustained by sound reasoning. So this quackery was debunked as quackery in 1844. And we'll come back to this in a moment. Oopsies. What did I do? There we go. Around the time that Horace Mann was promoting this crazy idea about government schools in America, over in Europe, these guys were promoting the same idea, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They wrote in Principles of Communism that the education of all children from the time they can get along without their mother should be in state institutions. And I think a lot of Americans don't understand how radical that was at that time because we've all grown up with government schools. That was the norm. Well, back then, this was crazy. You're going to force me to send my kids to Caesar to be educated, right? That was a radical idea. And within a few generations, we saw how that worked out for Germany, right? They're goose-stepping around and putting people in camps and invading their neighbors. And it didn't work out well for the Germans, and it's not going to work out well for us. 50 years after Horace Mann launched this experiment in government schooling came John Dewey. And he actually, I think a little bit unfairly today, gets credit as the founding father of America's public education system. And I think Horace Mann deserves part of the blame or the credit, depending on your point of view. And John Dewey, just like Horace Mann, was not really hiding what he believed. He was a communist. He wanted America to be a communist country. Instead of going to Prussia, he went to the Soviet Union, and he was thrilled with what Lenin was doing. He wrote articles in the New Republic about how wonderful the Soviet Union was. He thought the schools were doing a great job instilling a collectivistic mentality into all the children, and that's what he wanted for America. He actually pointed to this novel here, Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, about a communist America in the year 2000. No private property, get rid of all that individual freedom. That's what he wanted for our country. And he knew the best way to bring it about was through the government education system. So he actually wrote this incredible essay. We reprinted it in the book, Crimes of the Educators. We've got some, Caleb's got some in the front, and you can get a copy if you like. But this essay, The Primary Education Fetish, you should read it. All this time we spend teaching little kids how to read, write, and do math. We don't need to be doing that, especially when they're so young. What we really need to do is socialize them so they understand they're part of the collective. They need to have the right attitudes and values. And he did recognize, by the way, that quote there comes straight from this essay, change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So he understood very well that parents would not go for this. So instead he went to the Rockefellers. They gave him $3 million through one of their philanthropies. He set up an experimental school, rounded up a whole bunch of disciples, took over Teachers College at Columbia University, and then they fanned out across America, taking this craziness with them. They also believed in eugenics, right? The pseudo-scientific quackery that we're going to perfect humankind by guiding reproduction. Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood founder, believed the same nonsense. And one of the big things that John Dewey did was resurrect this whole word quackery that I mentioned earlier. The idea that you teach children to read whole words as if the words themselves were symbols, instead of teaching them that each letter is a symbol, which represents one or more sounds, and you got to blend them together to read. Well, they were teaching the kids that memorize entire words as if we were reading Chinese. And of course, again, it was absolutely devastating. In 1955, this guy Rudolf Flesch published a awesome book exposing the quackery. It really started to take off after World War II when all the school districts had money again. And in this book, he put it very diplomatically. He said, the teaching of reading all over the United States, in all the schools, in all the textbooks, is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense. So serious stuff, right? Now we can do brain scans. We can see the physical damage this does to the brains of children. You can compare children who learned how to read the correct way with phonics versus children who were exposed to the quackery. What you see is physical damage in the brains of the children who were exposed to this quackery. They develop symptoms that today we know as dyslexia. And they'll say, oh, we just need to spend $1 million and put them in a special program and hire a bunch of consultants and all this stuff. What you really need to do is teach them phonics. But anyways, you're probably not surprised to know that this is mandatory under Common Core. In kindergarten, they get the kids memorizing sight words. And then parents say, well, you need to teach my kid phonics. Oh, don't worry, we're going to teach your kids some phonics in first grade after they've already developed this harmful reflex to look at words as if the words themselves were the symbols. This is what it looks like, right? You see this in classrooms all over America. And now UNESCO is promoting this for the whole world. They say we need to teach children all over the world a sight vocabulary. So now I want to talk a little bit about John Dewey's religion, because it is today the official religion of the United States, whether they tell you that or not. He was one of the authors and one of the signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. So he was open about his beliefs. I think that's what's so incredible. The first tenet of their religious manifesto was that religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Pretty radical, right? If you know your Bible, you know the first words, in the beginning, God created. Right? So they were telling you right to your face, we reject God. And even if you don't take the Bible as seriously as I think you ought to, and in this here, Proverbs 1:7, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? So you think they're getting a lot of knowledge without the fear of the Lord? Of course not. But even if you don't take the Bible as seriously as I think you should, the founding fathers said this was a self-evident truth, right? They didn't say it was a religious statement that God created us and that God gave us rights. They said it's self-evident. It's just obvious. You know, again, my 2-year-old, you take his teddy bear, he'll tell you that's my private property. Give me it back, right? Everybody can see that God endowed us with these rights. It's self-evidently true. You don't need to read your Bible to know that. And what happens if you remove the Creator? Well, John Dewey understood very well. Then you don't have inalienable rights anymore. In fact, we can take those privileges from you at any time that we think it's convenient. If you read the rest of the Humanist Manifesto, it's basically just communism wrapped up in pseudo-religious garb. They tell you that we need a cooperative economic order. We need to get rid of the profit motive. We need equitable distribution of the means of life. And, of course, we've heard this religion before, right? The idea that man can be his own little God and man can decide what's right and wrong and man can save man, right? We've heard that. Genesis 3:5, the snake. So, hey, God doesn't want you to do that. He just knows that when you do, when you defy him, then you will be as gods, right? Just like the humanists say, you can be your own little God. And, of course, the Supreme Court turned this into our official religion. In 1962, this wonderful little prayer here, not sectarian, developed by Catholics, Jews, and Protestants. God, we acknowledge our dependence on you. We ask your blessings on our teacher, our country, our parents, our school, etc. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. In 1963, they said no more Bible readings at school. And they said, we have to do this because the First Amendment. And, you know, if the kids had gotten a good education, they would have said, wait a minute, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. Is the state of New York Congress? Is my local school district Congress? Well, no, of course they're not, right? You guys know that. But the Supreme Court apparently didn't. They said, we need to incorporate this First Amendment to apply to all the states and local governments. Well, if you know anything about history, and I'm sure the Supreme Court justices did, they would know that most of the states actually had established churches when the First Amendment was written. So very clearly, very self-evidently, it wasn't designed to prohibit states from having a prayer at school, right? I mean, obviously. What they did, though, this dissenting justice, Potter Stewart, pointed it out very clearly and very succinctly. These rulings led not to a state of neutrality with regards to religion, but to the establishment of a religion of secularism or humanism, as we might call it today, right? So they established they did exactly what Congress was not allowed to do. And now this false religion, this dangerous, evil religion is taught to every child in every government school all over America at taxpayer expense. So, you know, you thought established churches were bad. How about established government brainwashing of religion? Now, this is all going global, right? The UN has told us for a long time this was going global. In the 1940s, they came up with this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They said education shall be compulsory and it shall further the activities of the United Nations. And if you think the UN is a dictator's club straight from the pit of hell that ought to be dismantled, if you teach that to your kids, you're depriving them of their human right to an education that furthers the activities of the UN. That's what they'd say. The first Secretary General of the UN's education agency, UNESCO, said the purpose was a political unification in some sort of world government. They put out a pamphlet that my friend Bill Jasper here reported on, saying that schools need to be used to combat family attitudes. And in the interest of time, we'll fast forward to 1990 when they came up with an official international agreement on these issues. They brought all the governments of the world together in Thailand, and they ratified this Education for All agreement. And they said in Article 5, all children need to be subjected to the same learning standards. And who's going to decide these learning standards? Well, they'll tell you. The basic learning content required by all human beings is no longer a function of families or local school boards or Congress. Now it's a common and universal responsibility. So Rocket Man Kim Jong-un and Robert Mugabe and Fidel Castro, they all get to help us decide what is the basic learning content required by all human beings. In 2000, they got even bolder. They did another Education for All. They brought all the governments of the world together in Africa, and they said governments must implement integrated strategies in education which recognize the need for changes in attitudes, values, and practices. They're saying this openly, right? Every government on the planet signed on to this. Here's the head of the United Nations in 2015 saying what education should do.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
So education must nurture global citizens. Well, here in 2016, they got even bolder. They got the Global Action Plan for Education, and they said education must promote the integrated development of the whole person, again, including their spirituality. And keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Here is Irina Bokova. She was the head of UNESCO until last year, also a member of the Bulgarian Communist Party. She dutifully served the mass-murdering dictatorship there that slaughtered about 222,000 people. She hates me with a passion, and that makes me very happy. And she sent out this press release, went to everybody on UNESCO's mailing list, all the journalists on UNESCO's mailing list, said we have the duty, the collective duty, so the UN has the duty to empower every child and youth with the right values to shape the future as responsible global citizens. Here she is talking, but in the interest of time, we'll fast through. On the UNESCO website, you can see this UN Education for Sustainable Development Toolkit. And what they'll tell you, you can still read this on their website, generally more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education actually increases the threat to sustainability. You think they want well-educated kids? Here's what they want your kids to believe. This is a board game that UNESCO developed for use in government schools all over the world. The kids need to get the right answer and then they can move to the next square. And the question is, one of the many questions, what is the best way to fight poverty? Well, and if you have two brain cells to rub together, you look around the world, you say, what are the richest countries? Switzerland, America, Japan, Canada. What do they all have in common? Oh yeah, private property rights, stock markets, free markets, small government, low taxes. Well, according to the UN, the best way to fight poverty is to share the wealth produced in the world. I mean, you'd think Hugo Chavez wrote this stuff, right? This is what they're teaching to the kids. Here's UNESCO explaining how they're going to advance their ideology.
The Education 2030 Agenda is our roadmap to inclusive and quality education for all. UNESCO, the UN's specialized agency for education, is leading the global and regional coordination of this ambitious goal, responding to cutting-edge global challenges, supporting countries to build better education systems, and monitoring progress to make sure the world stays on course.
So they're helping countries to build better education systems. They're monitoring our progress to make sure we stay on course with their global education system. And boy, are we ever, right? Even here in America. This is Arnie Duncan. He gave a speech to UNESCO a few years before he retired, and he said UNESCO is his global partner. He bragged that they were turning your children into green global citizens through the education system. He quoted a communist terrorist. I won't tell you which one because we'd need an additional presentation. But he said education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. Did you guys know education was a weapon to change the world? Well, now you do, right? And here we thought we were sending our kids to learn how to read and write. Well, they'll tell you, right? Education is a global public good, unconstrained by national boundaries. So it's not your school board, it's not your state legislature, it's not even Congress. Now it's a global public good. In another speech, he said we must advance the sustainability movement through education. And here we thought it was all about teaching the kids to read and write. Well, now they have a world core curriculum. UNESCO has this on their website. You can read it there. It's like a common core, but for the planet. And it was developed by this guy, Robert Mueller. No relation to the special counsel, as far as I know. But he wrote in a letter to all the educators of the world. He said this was the product of the United Nations, the meta-organism of human and planetary evolution. He actually called the UN the body of Christ. And if there's any Christians in here, that should horrify you. But he said this World Core curriculum is the curriculum of our universal knowledge. It should be taught in all the schools of the earth. And he gave us some really in-depth insight. He actually put together a teacher's manual for this World Core curriculum. You can get it at your local library probably. And in the foreword, which he wrote, Robert Mueller, he said, and I quote, the underlying philosophy upon which the Robert Mueller School or the World Core curriculum is based will be found in the teachings set forth in the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Jewel Kuhl. And to most Americans, that means nothing. You just read right over that without even thinking about it. Well, everybody who leads the UN knows who Alice Bailey is. I'll give you a hint. She was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. Nice company these people keep, huh? They've changed the name since then. It was a little bit controversial. Now they call it the Lucius Trust, but they still believe the same demonic claptrap. And this Tibetan teacher they were talking about, Jewel Kuhl, turns out he's not Tibetan, he's not a teacher, he's not even a person. Right? Alice Bailey claimed to be in communication with what she described as ascended masters. These spiritual entities, and the Tibetan, this Jewel Kuhl was the chief among them. If you've read your Bible, you know she's talking about demons. But anyways, this ascended master would write these books. It would take over her body and write these books for her. This is what she explained, not me telling. And one of the books that she wrote, I mean, they wrote. You should get copies of these books because you really get some insight into where this is all going. But this book, Education in the New Age, written by Alice Bailey and Javal Kuhl, they wrote, world citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened with a world federation and a world brain. Now think about world brain in the context of the internet, right? This is getting creepy. And they say our problem is to attain the kind of overall synthesis that Marxism and neo-scholasticism provide for their followers, but to get this by the freely chosen cooperative methods that John Dewey advocated. So they want to brainwash you into signing up for their agenda. They don't want to have to use brute force. They will if you make them, but they'd rather use the freely chosen cooperative methods advocated by John Dewey. So that's where this is all going. You're thinking, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. Oh, yes, it does. Right? In 2015, the UN put out this report, Education for All, about the status. Where are we? They said when we started this in 1990, only 12 countries had national standards and national tests. Now we have over 100, and it's actually a lot more now. In America, we call them Common Core. And who funded Common Core in America? Well, mostly taxpayers. But behind taxpayers was this guy, Bill Gates. Here he is standing next to the head of UNESCO at the time. And he put $2 billion of his own money into this, and very few people know. Actually, Phyllis Schlafly got a hold of this agreement. Bill Gates signed an agreement with UNESCO in 2004 to create a global curriculum and a master syllabus to brainwash all the teachers of the world. And several years later, Bill Gates got involved with creating Common Core. So I want to show you something about Common Core here. This video was produced by the people who brought you Common Core, and I'm just going to let them speak for themselves.
Up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no.
Shanghai?
Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too.
Seattle, Chicago, Shanghai, and Paris. They match up with international standards.
So even though local communities will still design their own curriculum with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase.
So now we have the same rules with Shanghai and Paris and Timbuktu. Isn't that great? Well, if you want a totalitarian new world order with sustainable development as the guiding theology/ideology, yeah, that's awesome. If you love liberty, if you love God, if you love America, probably not. Unfortunately, this has not stopped under the Trump administration. Trump did something amazing. He got us out of UNESCO. But Ronald Reagan got us out of UNESCO, and then as soon as the next president came along, we were right back in. In fact, we paid up all the stuff that we were supposed to have paid if we had been members all along. So Betsy DeVos went down to Argentina last year, signed the G20 Education Ministers Declaration. They said we're going to infuse our shared values into the curricula. And you wonder, what shared values do we have with the most murderous dictatorship that's ever existed on the planet? What shared values do we have with the regime in Saudi Arabia that'll chop your head off for becoming a Christian? I don't know. Someone should ask Betsy DeVos. But then they concluded shared value, common values like sustainable development. Here we are again, right? They also said we commit to facilitating the internationalization of education. And they do this every year, right? These international agreements where they promise to globalize education. And back to the polling data. 55% of young Americans would rather have socialism. Here you see the growth of religiously unaffiliated, so humanists, secularists, atheists, agnostics, etc. Here you see the religious affiliation of Americans and the trends. You see Protestant Christianity, steep decline. Catholics are in moderate decline. They're staying almost level just because the southern border is open and a lot of Catholics are coming from Latin America. Then you see none is skyrocketing, right? That's the humanist, the atheist, the secularist. And this is interesting because even a lot of the people who say they're Christians are actually humanists in their worldview, in their beliefs. And so at some point soon, if it hasn't happened already, Christians will no longer be the dominant religious group in America. We will, as Obama said, we will no longer be a Christian nation, and that is their plan, right? So everything I just showed you is a documented fact. You can check it out from the primary sources. That's why I gave you the videos and stuff. Now I'm going to just spend a couple moments telling you about my opinion. And you can toss my opinion right out the window. Maybe you have a better solution to this. I'd love to hear it. But I think we need to start by asking ourselves some fundamental questions. The first one is, can we reform this monstrosity called a public education system? And the short answer is no. We just can't. It's doing exactly what it was intended to do. If you take a car that works perfectly to your mechanic and say, fix it, he's going to say, what do you mean? It works perfect. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It gets you from point A to point B. What do you mean, fix it? It's doing exactly what the people who designed it intended it to do. One of the conspirators who was involved in establishing this monstrosity in America, this guy here, Orestes Brownson, he actually became a Christian. He repented of this evil, and he tried to blow the whistle. But he said the great object was to get rid of Christianity. Boy, are they doing a good job, huh? They said the plan was not to make open attacks on religion, but to do it quietly. We're going to set up a system of state and national schools. All religion would be excluded, and we would force parents to send their children there. We would compel the parents to send their children there by law. So, schools are doing exactly what they were supposed to do, long before we had a Department of Education. This is Thomas Massey, great congressman. I interviewed him about some of these subjects, and he's got a great bill in Congress, H.R. 899, to abolish the Department of Education. Awesome bill, but there's this mistaken notion out there that cutting out the Department of Education would be like cutting off the head of the snake. It would be no such thing. We're dealing with a hydra now, right? Getting rid of the Department of Education would be nice, and we should do that, but it won't solve the problem. It will not allow us to send our children back into this system.
You have a bill about the education
so we'll skip
department.
this just in the interest of time. As I see it now, we have two real options. Option one, we need to get our children out of the public school system in massive numbers as quickly as we can possibly do it. Option two, start getting comfortable with slavery, because it's coming, right? Absent of divine intervention, it's over, folks. Progressives are winning, and they're going to keep winning and winning and winning and winning until they're so tired of winning that they'll just be tired. But there is really good news, and the good news is 7 out of 10 Americans would rather get their children out of government schools. That's according to the polling data. The overwhelming majority of Americans knows that something is wrong with this. They don't want to send their kids there. They don't realize how urgent it is, or they would have withdrawn them yesterday, but they want to, right? They would rather homeschool. They'd rather send their kids to private school. They need to be doing that. So what we're saying now, I borrowed this phrase from my friend E. Ray Moore, who founded a ministry 22 years ago devoted to getting Christian children out. I think we need to get all children out. But we need a Dunkirk operation. So the British Army was stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk in World War II, about to be annihilated by Adolf Hitler's National Socialists. And the British people got on their knees and they prayed, and they put every resource in their society at the disposal of this rescue operation. They took everything that could float across the English Channel, every fishing boat, every yacht, every canoe, every Navy vessel, rescued as many men as they could, brought them back to Britain to live to fight another day, and guess what? It worked, right? They lived to fight another day, and they're not speaking German today, I can report happily. So, parents and families, you know, it's pretty obvious. I don't know that I have to say it, but you got to get your kids out, right? If you have your kids in the public school system, you must get them out. It's not just your kids that are at stake. It's not just your family that's at stake. It's your whole country, your church. Everything is on the line here, your liberties. So parents, families, get the kids out. Grandparents, maybe you can help. You know, Jim mentioned earlier that they were helping to fund the tuition for their grandchild. A lot of our kids, you know, aren't making enough money to do what they need to do, so maybe grandparents can step in with some encouragement. Maybe you can volunteer to homeschool the kids for 1 or 2 days a week. You know, find a way to encourage your children to do this, or you are going to be very sorry. Pastors, priests, rabbis, big role for you here too. Step one, warn your congregation about what's happening. God put you as a shepherd of your flock for a reason. Or you're supposed to warn them about dangers. This is an existential threat to the children in your congregation. Data by the Nehemiah Institute shows that something like 80% of Christian children from Christian homes who go through 12 years of government brainwashing are going to leave the church. So your church is not going to survive if you don't get busy on this sounding the alarm. And I know you don't want to offend the government school teachers in your congregation. I totally understand and I sympathize. The reality is they already know everything I'm telling you. That's why they homeschool their kids. That's why they put their kids in private schools in massively larger numbers than the rest of the American population. They know how bad this is. At our homeschool co-op, we have more government school teachers participating in our homeschool co-op than anything else by far, right? Why? Because they know. They know all this. The teachers in your congregation are probably wondering, why are you not talking about this when our children are being fed to the lions, right? You got to get them out. You can also help provide alternatives. This church here, amazing. They have an alternative to the government education system. So get involved, right? If your church doesn't have that, talk to the pastor. Maybe he can set up a school there. Maybe he can bring in Freedom Project Academy. We partner with churches so that the pastor doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. Maybe if your church is too small, get together with another group of 10 pastors and set up a Christian school between all of you. Set up a scholarship fund so that low-income families in your church can get their children out or homeschool. All kinds of things you can do to help get God's children out of the enemy's indoctrination system, right? So we also need to ask another fundamental question. Why do we even have education? And who should be in charge of it? What is the purpose of an education? So you can get a good job and get a high-paying job and go retire in Florida and buy a nice car? Of course not, right? God tells us a lot about education. He also tells us who should control it. In Proverbs 22:6, he says, Caesar should train up a child in the way, and your guys are all looking at me like he didn't say that. And of course he did, right? Parents are supposed to train up a child in the way that he should go, right? And when he's old, he will not depart from it. If Caesar trains up that child in the way that he should go, when he's old, he's not going to depart from it, chances are. And that, Caesar is perpetrating mass murder of unborn children. Caesar is telling kids they can be any gender they want. Caesar is starting illegal wars based on lies. Is that who you want to raise up your children in the way that they should go? I hope not. Deuteronomy 11:19 says parents should teach these laws to their children when they're laying down, when they're waking up, all the time, right? Fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Notice he's not talking to Caesar. Who should be in charge of education? Parents should, with a supplemental role from the church, not Caesar. You can search Scripture all day long. You'll never find any reference to Caesar overseeing the education of children. In Proverbs 9:10, God tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And the Lord is less welcome in a public school today than head lice. Do you think your child is going to get any wisdom out of a public school? Well, if you believe the Bible, you can be sure that child is not going to get any wisdom. They'll get counterfeit wisdom. They'll get fraudulent wisdom. They'll get fraudulent knowledge. Martin Luther put it this way, that the high schools will become great gates of hell unless they diligently teach the Scriptures. That's what they've become. The Pope Pius XI, he said that every form of teaching children which is confined to the mere forces of nature, rejects or neglects the matters which contribute with God's help to the right formation of Christian life, is false and full of error. So for you Catholics out there, do you want your children to receive an education that is false and full of error? I hope not. Harvard once understood the purpose of an education. This is remarkable. Back then, they used to be a good school. They said that every student should be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. Right? Can you imagine how great of a school Harvard used to be? John Milton, one of the greatest thinkers of our civilization, said that the end of our learning, the purpose of our learning, is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, and to be like him. So that is the purpose of an education. And that is not my family. That's a picture of them, and we do homeschooling. We absolutely love it. I can't recommend it highly enough. It is so awesome. I'm going to give you a little bit of the data. These men here were mostly homeschooled. Primarily, these men were educated at home. And some of them got some supplemental education from private academies, tutors. Most of them went on to get a good college education at a good Christian school. But they were primarily taught by their parents, by their older siblings, by their grandparents, aunts and uncles, things like that. Abraham Lincoln was almost exclusively homeschooled. And, he went on to do some things that are maybe controversial. But these men created the most prosperous, the freest nation in the history of the world, and they never stepped one toe into a government school. How did they do it? They got a home education, and with a supplemental role for the church and for tutors and private academies. Today, there's really good news. We have 2.5 million children who are being homeschooled, maybe more. A lot of states don't even keep track of that data. Homeschoolers are scoring on average in the 80th to 90th percentile on the government's own standardized academic tests. So that ought to tell you something, right? With about $500 a year is about how much an average homeschool family spends. I spend more brainwashing other people's kids through my property taxes than I spend homeschooling my own kids, just to give you some perspective. We spend maybe a couple hours a day on our home education, in a reasonable day. And yet, and this is true for most homeschoolers, and yet homeschoolers are beating the pants off the victims of the government school kids who spend all day, every day preparing for these ludicrous tests. How does that work? And this is true even when parents don't even have a high school diploma, right? I say only half jokingly, you could put your kid in a closet for 12 years. They'd be much better off than they are in the government school system. And I'm only half joking, right? The homeschool kids now are winning all the science fairs, the engineering fairs. The universities are now out there looking for them because they know, hey, these kids are going to go on to do big things, right? We want more money in our endowment. Go find the homeschoolers, right? They know which bathroom to go into. That's nice. And the research shows, even on socialization, a lot of parents are, oh, well, I want my kids well socialized. Don't worry, folks. The data is out there. Go to the National Home Education Research Institute, headquartered down in Oregon. Homeschoolers do better on every metric that we can measure on socialization. They have better self-image, less peer dependence, better communication skills. They interact better with people of all ages. They do better as adults. They get better jobs. They make more money. Their marriages fall apart less often. They stay in church. They start more companies. They go to jail less frequently. They do less drugs. Every possible thing you can measure, homeschoolers do better. This is the best thing you can do for your kids. If you can't do that, if you don't want to do that, there's a lot of really great private schools out there. You should get involved. There's one right here at this school. Maybe you have grandkids. Maybe you have kids. Take a look at what Covenant Church is doing. Great stuff is happening here. There's also a lot of other, but I should caution too, there's a lot of terrible private schools. About half of Catholic dioceses in America today are using Common Core. And Catholics have traditionally had a very good education system. Even a lot of non-Catholics went there because they provided a very good education. Today, half of Catholic dioceses are using Common Core. You can't put lipstick on a pig, to quote Sarah Palin, right? That's not good. A lot of Protestant schools today, they're just carbon copies of the government school. Some of them are even using the government school textbooks. Don't send your kids to those types of schools, right? Why would you flush money down the toilet to give your kid a government education? Don't do it. Do your due diligence. You wouldn't let a stranger come in off the street to teach your kids. You don't send your kid to any random stranger. Do your homework. Freedom Project Academy, which was mentioned earlier, is a great online school that I teach at, Advanced Economics, run by Duke Pesta. We partner with churches. You get a Christian education, classical education along the lines of what the founders got. So yeah, you got to learn Latin. You got to learn logic. You're going to learn, rhetoric, all these skills and ideas that have been lost. You'll learn how to read with phonics. You'll get real history, real science, amazing things. And we need to realize they're not going to let this situation persist, right? We've got millions of kids in America today. Probably 12, 15% of American children are out of the government school system, and many of those are getting a phenomenal education. And the UN is upset about this. The dictator-controlled Human Rights Council passed a resolution in 2015 saying, oh my goodness, we need to regulate and monitor all these private schools. They all need to teach the same standards as the government schools because maybe they're not doing as good a job. Yeah, right, because parents are going to spend a lot of money sending their kids to a subpar school, right? But they're coming for the homeschool kids. They're coming for the private schools. They're telling us that. I think the reason is they're concerned. You guys know the story of the emperor who had no clothes. It just took that one kid who slipped through the cracks. Say, wait a minute, that guy's naked. Suddenly everybody was like, oh, wait a minute, is he really naked? Can we say that? Right? And that's what they're worried about. They're worried that if kids slip through the cracks of the indoctrination, they're going to have a big problem. And these homeschool kids, these kids in the good private schools, they can run circles around the kids in the government indoctrination centers. That's going to be a big problem for them later. So they're going to circle back and come for us at some point. Now, let me remind you, they're indoctrinating your kids into just absolute evil, into sickness, right? This is what they're doing. They're dumbing your kids down on an industrial scale to the point where half of adult Americans cannot read, right? They can't read the newspaper, they can't read their Bible. And, we're sitting here thinking, oh, they're never going to impose tyranny on us. I've got my gun. They could take it from my cold, dead hands. And, don't get me wrong, I agree. They could take my gun from my cold, dead hands, and there's absolutely no other way they're going to get it. But we need to recognize our guns are going to be useless against this, right? Are you going to use them against your own kids? Well, of course you're not, right? So they're laughing at us. You think you're going to protect yourself with your guns? Good luck. And then Hitler put it well, right? He was wrong about almost everything, but he was right on this, right? He was right on the money when he figured out that, hey, government brainwashing, that's the way we're going to build our 1,000-year Reich. He was only wrong because we showed up and kicked his butt. But when an opponent declares, I will not come over to your side, I calmly say, your child belongs to us already. You will pass on, but your descendants now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community. Folks, that's where we are now. A lot of our kids know nothing else but this new community. I had some government school children come to my house for 4th of July. They say, what are we celebrating today, boys? Well, 4th of July. Well, what happened on 4th of July? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? No, I don't know. Okay, we declared independence. Who did we declare independence from? I don't know. They know nothing, folks. They know nothing. And that's where we are today. They know, gender theory. They know climate change is going to kill us unless we let the UN run our lives, but they know nothing of what they need to know to sustain our civilization. So we need an exodus from the government schools, and we could take an example from our founders. They put their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line. The odds were looking insurmountable, right? The most powerful military in the world, we're going to go up against that with some ragtag farmers and some rifles. Oh, good luck with that. And they did it, right? For God, for freedom, for country, they did it. And guess what? They won. Right? Today, luckily, we don't have to risk our lives. We don't have to risk our fortunes or even our sacred honor. In fact, it's a lot of fun to pull your kids out of the system. And there's all these amazing side benefits, right? Better kids, happier kids, smarter kids, more moral kids, better communities, happier family, better marriage, right? It's just better all around. If you're not involved in the John Birch Society yet, it's been mentioned several times, you got to get involved, right? This is the organization that has kept us as free as we are for the last 60 years. Without the JBS, we probably would already be slaves. And I'm not exaggerating at all. Most people don't realize that JBS has been fighting these battles for 60 years very successfully. And in exchange, we've gotten nothing but hate speech from the mainstream media, but that's okay. We're not in it for the credit. But you need to get involved with the JBS. It's named after Captain John Birch here. He was a missionary taking the gospel to the people of China. Then World War II broke out. Doolittle and his men landed, and he rescued them. And they said, "Hey, you need to join military intelligence." And he really wanted to preach the gospel, but duty called, so he joined military intelligence for a time. He kept preaching the gospel, obviously. But shortly after World War II ended, he was murdered by Chinese communists. And Robert Welch, who founded the society, considered him to be an amazing example of what it means to be an American. Right? And so that's why he named the society after John Birch. He didn't want John Birch to be forgotten, and this was an amazing man. So that's why the society is named after him. We have chapters in all 50 states. We're working to, as the motto explains, to bring about less government, more responsibility, and this is crucial, with God's help, a better world, right? And we recognize without God's help, there's nothing you can do. We're up against a monster that is so much more powerful than anything we can comprehend, that if God isn't involved, if we don't rely on God for assistance here, pack up your bags and go home. There's no purpose in going any further, because without God, you're done, right? But anyways, all we do is education. We don't get involved in politics, and we don't back candidates or anything like that. We just educate the public. Right now, I'm educating you on what's happening in the government school system, because CNN won't do it, Washington Compost won't do it, New York Slimes won't do it. We also educate people on the deep state, the effort to subvert our freedoms, what the Constitution says. And again, this is the organization that has kept America free for 60 years. If you want to know more about my tour, you can go to libertysentinel.org/tour. I'm going all over the United States. About half of my speeches have been organized by local chapters of the John Birch Society. The other half are through churches, Tea Party groups, GOP organizations, Republican clubs, things like that. Go to libertysentinel.org/tour. And if you've got a friend in Seattle, in Phoenix, in Albuquerque, in Houston, in Oklahoma, pick your place. Send them to the website, tell them, call that person who's listed as the contact person, and come to this speech so that you can learn what's going on in the government school system. And finally, I'm going to ask you for just one thing. You always have to ask people to do something at the end of a speech. I'm not going to ask you for money. I'm not going to ask you for anything. Just one thing. Get a copy of this special report here in the New American Magazine, Rescuing Our Children. Caleb's got copies out for, is it $1 donation or $2? Okay, $1 donation is all it takes. That's our cost to get these. Get one or get 100 if you're already convinced. But if you're not convinced yet, get one, read it from front to back. And if you agree that this is the most important, every other issue we're fighting is worthwhile. Save the unborn babies, we got to do it. Reduce the size and scope of government, we got to do it. Restore our Constitution, got to do it, right? We got to do all those things. But this education issue transcends every one of those. And we're going to lose on every one of those battles if we don't take this education crisis seriously. So if you agree that we have to get serious about the education question, go back, or you can get more at thenewamerican.com/rescuingourchildren. Go back and order 50 or 100. We've got a lot of people who've now ordered 1,000 all across the country. Get it to your pastor, to the elders at your church, to local business people that you might know, to your congressman, to your state representative, to your school board members, to your public school teachers, to the neighbors across the street with the cute little kids that get on the school bus every day. Get this information out there, because parents don't know what's happening, pastors don't know what's happening, and if they don't know what's happening, they can't do anything about it. We've got to get the word out. Finally, I want to close with a scripture, because I don't want anybody to leave here thinking that it's just a political problem or even just an educational problem. We're dealing with a spiritual battle, right? And this much is very clear. Read the writings of Alice Bailey. She knew it was a spiritual battle. Read John Dewey. He knew it was a spiritual battle. We need to understand also that this is a spiritual battle. And God tells us about the spiritual battle. In Ephesians 6:12, he tells us we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. So keep that in mind as you go out and do something about this. It's a spiritual battle. Pray. Pray for America. Pray for our liberties. Pray for our school teachers, for our children. Pray that God would bring about a revival in this country, that parents would get involved and retake power over the education of their children, because without God and without dealing with this education issue, we're toast. That's all I have, folks. Thank you so much. God bless you, and God bless America. And here is Jim and Caleb.